And in Mark's gospel, it simply begins when John the Baptist comes out of the desert. And John comes out preparing the way for the Lord who is to come. And then Jesus comes forward and is baptized by John, and the Spirit comes down upon him. No mention again of Bethlehem, of Nativity, of Mary, of any of those stories. And for whatever reason, it seemed appropriate to Mark simply to begin when the so-called public life began. Now, if you went to the fourth gospel, the last one written, that of John, you might say there we find a different take altogether, because it goes back to the earliest imaginable moment. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Again, no mention of Bethlehem, angels, Mary and Joseph, but this firm conviction that Jesus, as the Son of God, was always there. And then the Word became flesh and became Jesus of Nazareth.
Why knowledge matters. Welcome, I'm your host, Yannick, and now joining me, Francis Clooney. Francis Clooney is the Parkman Professor of Divinity at Harvard University. Welcome, Frank, to the show. It's such a pleasure to have you finally back, and this time talking about the birth of Jesus and really look at the two different accounts of Matthew and Luke and how they differ. Welcome back, Frank. Such a pleasure and honor to have you.
Thank you, Yannick. Good to be with you early in the new year. Happy 2024. A snowy day in Boston, but good to be with you.
Really wonderful. Yeah, here too. I had to Snovel show a lot of guests the last few days because I love to have like a very nice porch. So it's beautiful. It's beautiful. I think we are simply blessed here in North America. So let's introduce first and foremost yourself for some new listeners and viewers. Who is Francis Clooney in one sentence?
That's a very difficult topic, one sentence. I am, as you said, a professor at Harvard University in the Divinity School, specialist in Hindu studies and then comparative Catholic Hindu theology. And I am a Catholic priest and a Jesuit, member of the Society of Jesus. And this is my 40th year of teaching at the university level. And this past summer, I visited India, marking 50 years since I first came to India. And that's all one sentence.
It's wonderful. So let's give us a taste how an ordinary day looks like in your life.
Ordinarily, I get up between 5 and 5:30 a.m. in the morning. I'll make some tea. Then I will sit in our chapel. So in the Jesuit house, we have a chapel. I'll sit in the dark in the chapel for my meditation period, 45, 50 minutes, something like that, quiet meditation. Then I will do a few yoga exercises. Then on alternate days, I'll go out for somewhere between a walk and a run, more walking than running at this point in my life. Then breakfast and then get to work. So by 7:30 or so, I'm going through things I need to do in the day, either class preparation, preparing some lecture, answering some of the many emails that came in overnight, and basically work through the day, excepting for meetings or classes. And then in the evening in the Jesuit house here, we usually have Mass at 6 p.m. and then dinner after that. And then after that, by 8 o'clock, I'll be back at work, trying to work until 9:30 or so, and then take some rest, watch some TV or something, and then usually I'm in bed by 10 o'clock, and then up the next morning between 5 and 5:30 again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for giving us such a detailed account of really an ordinary life, of an exceptional life that you're leading. I think you're truly one of the greatest comparatists, but also truly an outstanding academic. You're also part of the Royal Society in the UK, and truly an outstanding man, and the life you live, and also the decision that you took in your early life, really, when you still were, a young man, is tremendous.
Mm.
So let's look a little bit more specifically into the Bible and the two accounts that really talk about the birth of Jesus, which is obviously the backbone of Christian faith, more specifically. So I don't know if you want to start with Matthew or Luke, or or does it matter?
Well, I think to say something in general first, that the way we in the Christian tradition, I think East or West, celebrate Christmas, the Christmas season, is certainly entirely respectable and entirely understandable in terms of the devotion and theology that have developed over a very long period of time. But I would say that if one goes back into the New Testament itself, one begins to get a slightly different picture of how the birth of Christ was thought about in the beginning. And before getting to Matthew, if I could just point out two other texts. One is in St. Paul, I believe, in the letter to the Galatians, I think. I'd have to look it up. Paul simply says, he came and he was born of a woman. No mention of any details regarding the birth of Jesus, but rather simply that he was born of a woman, and of course, no mention of the name of Mary. So he says this in passing, and there's no great meditation on the birth of the Messiah or anything like that. And that's the oldest testimony we have in the New Testament to the birth of Jesus. And then the second oldest, perhaps, would be the beginning of the gospel according to Mark. And Mark, we believe, is the first of the four gospels before Luke and Matthew and John. And in Mark's gospel, it simply begins when John the Baptist comes out of the desert. And John comes out preparing the way for the Lord who is to come. And then Jesus comes forward and is baptized by John, and the Spirit comes down upon him. No mention again of Bethlehem, of Nativity, of Mary, of any of those stories. And for whatever reason, it seemed appropriate to Mark simply to begin when the so-called public life began. Now, if you went to the fourth gospel, the last one written, that of John, you might say there we find a different take altogether, because it goes back to the earliest imaginable moment. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Again, no mention of Bethlehem, angels, Mary, and Joseph, but this firm conviction that Jesus, as the Son of God, was always there. And then the Word became flesh and became Jesus of Nazareth. So these are the expansions, hardly a mention by Paul, not mentioned by Mark, and then this grand cosmic scheme of John. And in between, we have the two Gospels that give us the account that really are the source of Christmas as we understand Christmas. I think it might be better if I said something about Luke first and then Matthew, if that's okay. So, the familiar account that we see in many a Christmas scene, the creche, the Christmas crib, scenes in church, scenes on holiday cards that are sent, and so on like that, basically, I think, responds to the scene in the Gospel according to Luke, where after the angel has announced to Mary that she is to be the mother of Jesus, and after the birth of John the Baptist, then Joseph and Mary go to Bethlehem to register in the census. And while there, time comes for Mary to give birth to her child. But because there is no room in the inn, it's very crowded in the town because everyone has come back to register. They go to a stable among the animals, and in the manger out of which the animals would eat, then the baby is put in the manger. And the angel then comes and announces to the nearby shepherds in the night that something remarkable has happened. A Messiah has been born into your midst. Come and see this great thing that God has done. And as we know very well from Luke's gospel, the shepherds go over, and there they find Mary and Joseph and the baby in the manger. And they're amazed and filled with joy because somehow this ordinary birth of a poor child, of poor parents in a humble stable, they see and realize that this is what the angel was talking about, the birth of God on earth. And I think if you think about all the scenes we see, it's often that is the way we imagine the Christmas scene. One might simply add that from Matthew is often borrowed the three magi, the three wise people who come from the east, if there are three or some group that comes. And often they're portrayed carrying their gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And they're often assumed to be riding camels. And so the camels show up in the scene as well. And they're sort of like an add-on to the beautiful scene that we learned from Luke's gospel. So one could leave it at that and say, well, that's very good. And for most purposes, that is very good. But I think if one begins to ponder the particular way that Matthew puts forward what he has to say about the birth of Jesus, we realize that his account is somewhat different from that of Luke. And I can just say this briefly as well. So Luke, I think, is a very positive account. Even the poverty is beautiful, the harmony of the scene, the angels, the shepherds, the stable, all these things come together in a beautiful moment. But Matthew, right from the start, I think is a little bit more concerned about the troubles that arise. The first figure in Matthew chapter 1 who appears is not Mary, but Joseph. And Joseph is not visited by an angel as Mary was in Luke, but in a dream, he has a vision of the angel. And the angel comes to him. Why does the angel come? Because Joseph, to put it directly, has noticed that Mary is pregnant. And he has not had sexual relations with her yet. And therefore is very concerned that he's about to marry a woman who has already been with some other man. And he's a good man, he's a gentleman, and wants to send her back to her family without any public disgrace, to get basically send her home and not marry her, and break off the relationship. So this is the beginning of the scene. And how rarely do we hear much about this in church or in pious Christmas stories? Joseph is thinking of breaking off with Mary. And just before that, you have the very long and often perceived as tedious genealogy of Joseph, the family of David. And the scholars have pointed out there may be, 30, 40 names in the genealogy all the way back to the beginning, to Abram and then back to Adam and Eve. But in the account, there are several women mentioned, Tamar, Ruth, the unnamed wife of the unnamed woman who is with David, who becomes the mother of Solomon, and so on. And all these women are women in trouble. Tamar has had a terrible life and been pushed back and forth by the men in her life, but finally comes out of it okay. Ruth is not even Jewish. She's a woman who comes in from the outside. And in order to link up with Bathsheba, we know her name from other accounts, David has her husband killed because he's had a relationship with Bathsheba. She's pregnant, and it's very embarrassing. So he takes her as his wife, and her husband, Bathsheba's very good husband, is killed in battle by David's plan. So you have this kind of darkness at the beginning. There are 4 women mentioned before coming to the scene where Joseph is having his doubts, and then Joseph is having his doubts about Mary. So there's a scene of doubt. Then it simply says in Matthew's gospel at the beginning of chapter 2, and after the baby was born, then there are these wise people from the east who come. And he, again, doesn't go into any details. There's no account of a stable. There's no mention of angels. There's no beautiful pictorial setting. He just more or less boldly says, after the baby was born and given the name Jesus, there were these magi from the east who come. And this is a beautiful scene. They follow their own religion. They're perhaps what we might call astrologers. They come from the east. They read the stars, and they somehow know that something special is going to happen somewhere near Jerusalem. So they come looking for this child. it doesn't quite say, as we often see in the pictures, a very bright star like a spotlight shining down on Bethlehem. But they somehow read the stars and find their way as far as Jerusalem, and they're looking for the child, and innocently enough, they are called in, they go to and speak with King Herod, the local ruler, innocently asking about this child who is born, who will become the king. And they are just asking for advice and for directions. But a part of the point of Matthew is that this causes great turmoil in the palace, because Herod sees this talk of a child who will be the ruler, the king, as a threat. And so the beautiful scene that follows, where they find their way to Bethlehem, find their way to Mary, Joseph, and the baby, it says fall down on their faces, prostrate, and worship the baby, and they give their gifts and they're filled with joy, is in the scene where something terrible has been set in motion, because Herod wants them to come back and tell him where the baby is, as it says, so that he tells them so that he can come and worship the baby. But in fact, he's coming to kill the baby. So all of this is usually not, it's put on a separate feast in the Western calendar, the Feast of the Holy Innocents. So the angel comes, and the Magi escape into the desert in the night. Then an angel comes to Joseph again in a dream and says, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt. Be refugees, be migrants, get out of here as soon as possible. Something terrible is going to happen. And something terrible does happen. Herod knows that somehow the Magi have escaped his attention, and therefore what to do, which baby is the one who's the Messiah. He tells his soldiers, kill them all. Kill every boy in the village who's under age 2. And this is really the end of the story of the birth of Jesus for Matthew. Eventually, Joseph and Mary come back and they settle in Nazareth, as in Luke. But it seems to me that the whole Matthean side is a series of doubts, uncertainties, ending with a scene of terrible violence. And in my own meditations before Christmas and several talks I gave, I tried to say that it's actually good for us that we have the beautiful, positive, luminous account of Luke, but also realize that Matthew is saying, well, Jesus was born into a difficult world of uncertainty, of doubts, of jealousy, and ultimately of violence. And whether you see the world as very happy and bright, or if you see the world as dark and dangerous, the point is that Jesus comes into the world in which we live and is among us. And therefore, I think we learn a lot by reading Luke and Matthew next to one another, but realizing that they're actually talking about the story in a very different way. So I'd be happy to expand on any of those points, but that would be a start in what I'm thinking.
What was it specifically about the gospel that brought you in and that ultimately made you decide that you want to pursue a life of dedication and devotion to the Christian faith?
Well, I think the gospel is so central to Christian piety, Christian imagination, the Christian intellectual life, that it would be hard to imagine being a Christian without some knowledge of the story of Jesus. And for me, I'm not a convert to Christianity or to Catholicism, but was born into a Catholic family in New York City, Brooklyn, New York, in a Catholic church-going family. And we heard the priest any number of times talking about these stories, but from the birth of Jesus to the public ministry of Jesus to the death and resurrection of Jesus. So all these stories were known to us along the way. But I suppose that when I began to have you might say, on my own spiritual quest, or my own sense of looking for a deeper spiritual meaning for my life when I was a teenager, let's say 15 years old, it was natural that I would see my own personal story in the light of reflection of the story of Jesus. And that therefore, as with innumerable Christians before me, the idea was to somehow live a life being a companion of Jesus, or in imitation of the life of Christ, the imitatio Christi, to be like Christ, to do work like he did, to live like him, to be a person who speaks the good news. That this, in an implicit way for me as a young man, gave me a sense of the direction of my life, with a sense of the life of Jesus from the angel speaking to Mary to the resurrection, that somehow I would become one of the many figures part of the story of Jesus. And it all began there. For me, as a boy going to a Jesuit high school in New York City in the 1960s, if one had a sense of desiring to be like Jesus, one obvious way to live it out was to become a Jesuit. And so after high school, I just turned 18 years old and then entered the order and became a Jesuit. And in a sense, right from that then too, the message has always been, we're called to be companions of Jesus, like Jesus, work with Jesus, do as Jesus does, and follow it out as best we can. And so I think that's a simple version of how the gospel fits into my imagination and my own sense of vocation.
But it is also like the gospel are so, concise, they're so meaningful. And even if you're not born into a family, there's so many people. I mean, I see myself, faith was never part really in our household at all. And I'm still basically the only one in my whole family and extended family who, believes. And, so it is really profound. So what was specifically that, what indicated that you also ultimately made a career in academia? Because when you were young, could you ever imagine that you one day will be this great professor at this iconic institution?
I think not. I mean, so I think when we're young, we have, many plans and many dreams about the future. And I think I mean, you hear stories of people who always want to be president of the United States, or want to be an opera singer, or want to be a marathon runner. I think I wasn't so specific ever early on. And I think what really happened was that, as I've already said, a sense of a deep sense of a call or invitation to be like Jesus, or to be with Jesus, which for church-going Catholics or Christians was the gospel scene this past Sunday, so just several days ago, where Jesus is walking on the beach in chapter 1 of John's gospel. John the Baptist points him out, and the earliest apostles, Andrew and Peter and perhaps others, begin to follow Jesus on the beach. And he turns and looks at them and says, "What do you want? What are you looking for?" And they say, perhaps foolishly, "We're wondering where you live," not remembering what John has already just said, and the word was made flesh and lives among us. So it's a kind of an existential moment where these men meet Jesus and say, "Where do you live?" And he gives the beautiful invitation, "Come and see." And I think for me, like many a person who has a religious vocation, that sense of come and see, come with me, come and dwell with me, listen to me, speak with me. But all of that was sort of general. It wasn't come and see with me and then study Hinduism and then become a Harvard professor. None of that was really operative in that moment. But I think if we're anything in life, we do it according to who we are and what our gifts are. So I'm not a marathon runner. I'm not an opera singer. I had no gifts for politics and so on. But I'm a good student. I study. I love to read. I love to write. And so I think as a young Jesuit, loving the philosophy study, loving the theology study, finding so many interesting things that I could devote myself to, it became clear to me, and I think to the Jesuit order, that I was destined for some kind of a scholarly life, that I had the gifts and the patience and so on. And during the formation time of preparation for priesthood, I went for 2 years to Kathmandu, Nepal, up in the Himalayan mountains to teach school. And I was exposed for the first time to Hinduism and Buddhism. And I began to see and to realize the enormous possibilities of learning from other religions and other religious traditions, which I had not planned. When I became a Jesuit, I had no sense or interest in going to Asia, studying other religions or anything. It was just blank. But by the time I was ordained, there was a sense I'm happy as a Jesuit. I want to be a Catholic priest. I'm a good student, can be a scholar, and Hinduism will be part of my study. And so the pieces began to fall into place. And the rest of my life, after ordination, 1978, has really been doing further studies, PhD studies in Hinduism, getting a teaching position at Boston College, doing study of Hindu texts, teaching Hindu texts, and then making clear the Catholic-Hindu relationship, both in my life and in my studies and so on. And everything follows from there. So it sort of began with a general sense of vocation as an intellectual, running into Hinduism, and then wanting that to be part of my life as well. And it all came together. But if we went back, 40 years, 50 years from now, I couldn't have guessed the way things would work out.
What makes a truly a meaningful life to you? What's your one advice that you give to young people?
Well, I think one of the messages, and this could be in the classroom. I'm teaching at Harvard Divinity School. We have a very great mix of students of many different religious traditions. Some are, happily Hindu or Catholic or Buddhist. Others are spiritual seekers, spiritual but not religious. And I think in the classroom and then talking to students outside of class, I stress the point that, well, what is it that you're really the coming together of what is it you're capable of doing? And then what is it that gives you joy when you do it? Because there are things that we might be capable of. So one could imagine somebody very hardworking and talented could become a lawyer, but then realizing, well, I don't really want to be a lawyer, and being a lawyer might not make me happy. Or I'm a good athlete and I could run marathons all the time, but I don't have time for that. It's not a priority for me, so I don't want to do that. So where is it that the gifts you have, intellectual, social, personal gifts, and a certain sense of joy or happiness in your life come together? I suppose you could add too, looking at the world around you, what is needed in the world in which we live. So what problems are there around us? What's going on in 2024 that I think I could contribute to? And for a young person, I think that the point is not, you can't do everything. You can't take on all the problems of the world. And some people might go into government work, some might become medical doctors, some might become priests or ministers. Some might simply say, my job, my work is to marry, have a family, be a good father, a good mother in the family, raise the children, and go on from there. But you basically say the problems of the world are endless, and the good things in the world are endless too. So given my skills, what makes me happy and what's needed, how do I put that together? I think is sort of our side of the vocation story. We put the pieces together in terms of what we think we can do. And for some people, not all people, then there's a sense of religious vocation, a sense that God is calling me to this and not to that. But I think some combination of what you can do and what makes you happy is good advice for anyone to start with. Not to ambition the most famous or the most general, the most high paying or the most effective even, but what is it you're called to and what makes you happy really will enable a young person to say, I like doing this, I can do this. I actually could do this 40 years from now, 50 years from now, because it's a way of life, not something I'll take on because it's good, but I don't like it, but rather it gives me joy and I can do this.
That is so critical advice. Thank you so much, Frank. I think this is so helpful. to find, one's way, because it's truly the journey, and it's not always easy, but I think it's worthwhile to explore it. And the advice that you just gave is truly a blessing, and truly comes from a place of wisdom. What makes you feel alive?
Well, I think so. I'm getting old, 73 now, coming toward the end. Certainly closer to the end of my teaching career than the beginning. And I think what still gives me joy, and we begin teaching again second semester of this year next week. That what enables me to keep going is that on some fundamental level, I like who I am and what I do. It doesn't mean I think I'm perfect, or the world is so lucky to have me, but I think I'm grateful that it's working out pretty well. So I still like being a Jesuit. I still like being a Catholic priest. I still like going to the parish for Mass on Sunday and preaching, talking to the people. And I still enjoy very much teaching. And I think I would stop teaching when I no longer enjoy it or no longer look forward to it. But once a semester gets started, the students I teach are wonderful students. Harvard Divinity School is such an interesting body of students. Harvard College students come over. So I'm lucky to have very interesting students in class. And I think, as I found when I first taught in Kathmandu in the 70s, 50 years ago, I learned from my students. And as long as I can teach my students and they learn from me, but I also learn from their generational questions, their concerns, things I didn't think of, then it's all wonderful and it all fits together. My health is good. I have no real complaints in life. So to keep on the track I'm on gives me joy. I'm not the kind of person who says I should stop and do something entirely different. That might happen at some point, but basically to continue for as long as I can, the kind of thing I'm doing now seems to be right, and using my life as best I can.
Frank, thank you so much for truly being a gift to me and really to the world. It's always a particular honor talking to you. Thank you so much, Frank.
Thank you for your very good interviewing style, the questions you ask, and raising so many important issues. So thank you for inviting me for this interview today.
Francis Clooney. That's why knowledge matters. Make your life a masterpiece. Visit now programs.d-ykm.com.